Scott Bessent, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, is now talking about a potential bailout package for the USA. And he says here, quote, "We have a large toolkit that we can use in an emergency, which translates to nothing other than money printer go. In an emergency, they can use the printing press and flood the entire markets. And that will, of course, cause Bitcoin and risk assets to escalate. Many people are now interpreting this as active preparation for QE. And yesterday I mentioned that Scott Bessent is preparing shadow QE. And now we see the confirmation here as he clearly says, yes, we can pump liquidity into the market. And this will massively drive Bitcoin and all risk assets upwards. He is now making massive statements in a new interview that we absolutely need to look at. But it gets much, much tougher. We have here from Governor Waller, who is the Fed president here, new statements. He is making very dovish statements, very bullish statements, because he also wants to lower the interest rates. That means we might have a pivot at the central bank. We have a pivot in the US Treasury, and all signs point to money printing. And the craziest part one haven't even mentioned yet is that in the interview with Scott Bessent, there was also talk about removing Jerome Powell. There are already considerations about potential successors. And now it turns out that one of the successors could very well be Waller, who is now signaling interest rate cuts if they want to get rid of Jerome Powell here. Jerome Powell is not dovish enough here. He doesn't stimulate the markets enough. So a successor needs to be appointed here. And all the conspiracy theories that were still valid 3 or 4 weeks ago about the way things are, they want to remove Jerome Powell here, they want to print money, and so on. This is all becoming more and more confirmed. But first, let's take a look at what Scott has to say about the US dollar in his new interview.
We are still a global reserve currency. We have a strong dollar policy. The dollar can go up and down. If you go and look back at President Trump's first term, I don't remember the exact number, but the dollar in 2017 went down, I can't remember, 7, 8, 9%, and then once the tax bill was done, took off for the remainder of his term.
So, Mr. Mankier, one shouldn't worry about the US dollar here. The US dollar would still be the world reserve currency here, and it has always been the case in the past that the US dollar has gone up and down. Accordingly, he simply assumes that the US dollar will strengthen again gradually. We simply see the tendencies of de-dollarization, that countries want to move away from the US dollar. I also think that nowadays the trends are definitely much, much clearer than in 2017, as you mentioned during the last Trump administration, where there was a period of weakness. But now we're looking at the really relevant things here. That was just the warm-up here. And yesterday I talked about how the US wants to print money endlessly, but that it might be done in other, more creative ways. So not with dirt. QE here through the central bank. Sure, that will come at some point later, but first they're trying to do it through shadow QE. That means changing the banking regulations so that banks can hold more US treasuries. In other words, hold more government bonds, and are thus incentivized to buy more government bonds by simply manipulating the regulations. And this has been done in past crises as well. And Scott Bessent gave hints about this in an interview. And now he's actually giving the next interview where he again provides hints that the US has to buy government bonds because there simply aren't enough buyers. I mean, on the other hand, he says here, I'm not seeing a dumping of US Treasury. By that, he means that China is not selling government bonds, or Japan or something like that, but that is definitely happening, otherwise the interest rates wouldn't be going up as a last resort. And now they desperately need some buyers, and accordingly, they can get more buyers by changing banking regulations so that more banks hold treasuries. But now comes the next part because he made a very, very interesting statement in the interview. And here you can see a very, very creative way to print money. And yesterday I said it, they will find creative ways to print money here. And today the conspiracy theory has already become reality. He says here we could ramp up the buybacks if we wanted to. And Jerome Hedge then says, but hey, buybacks, that's not QE. So technically speaking, it might not be QE, but it has a similar effect, just like the shadow QE with the banking regulations. It's also not direct QE, but it has a similar effect, and here too, it means nothing other than printing money. And when he says here, it's not QE, it's of course meant sarcastically or ironically, because he also writes above, boom, because he knows very well that if this happens, the markets will explode upwards. Here, Jerome Hedge further comments on Bessent's remarks. Here, the next QE will definitely come. Bessent officially states here that it is still far from using emergency plans here. But he also says, sure, when asked if all options are on the table, and says the Treasury has a large toolbox here, meaning a large toolbox that could carry out the buybacks. So it's similar to the central bank here in Europe. Christopher Lagarde also says, yes, if it should be necessary, then we could utilize the complete toolkit. And you can already see it here in the comments. For example, here, this is huge. The Treasury's grasp for monetary power is now confirmed here. Reflecting essentially gives the green light from the Treasury here to conduct orchestrated open market operations to manipulate the curve here. So that they are engaging in yield curve control here, buying government bonds, not through the central bank, but doing it through the Treasury. And in this way, of course, they could also bring the interest rates down again. I also asked the AI for an assessment, and they see it the same way. Here, in the context of the US Treasury, this refers to the purchase of government bonds, meaning the government buys back its own debt bonds from the market. This is similar to quantitative easing, but technically it is not classic quantitative easing by the central bank, so it's not a Fed program, but would come directly from the Treasury, from the Ministry of Finance. So QE means the central bank prints money to buy bonds, liquidity enters the system, and buybacks from the Treasury mean the Ministry of Finance buys back bonds, mostly through debt management, but it acts similarly to QE, a liquidity boost, and that means Bitcoin to the moon, money printer go BRRR, well halla, let's fucking go, we're coming. But it's not just the Treasury that wants to stimulate here. We now also have very clear signs from the central bank that stimulation is intended and the printing press is to be fired up. Because we have a statement here from a central bank of the USA, who is very, very bullish, definitely indicating that he is ready to make rate cuts. And there's even the wild theory that this could be the one who might be the next candidate to replace Jerome Powell. Because we know that Donald Trump wants to remove Jerome Powell because Powell isn't lowering the interest rates. And the news is just coming in that Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says the Trump administration is considering the succession of Fed Chairman Powell and will begin interviewing candidates in the fall. And accordingly, the first people are probably already positioning themselves here. And if you ask me, it's no longer a conspiracy theory that Donald Trump is actively trying to kick Jerome Powell out of the Federal Reserve position. I mean, in principle, this is bullish for Bitcoin because if you have someone at the top position of the Federal Reserve who is more dovish and wants to stimulate massively, then it's naturally good for Bitcoin, for risk assets, and for the entire financial markets, at least in the short to medium term, because it injects liquidity into the market. I mean, in the long term, there's actually the risk again of some sort of system collapse or something like that. But even that wouldn't necessarily be bad for Bitcoin. And we actually have statements from Christopher Waller, who is a Fed president. Let's take a quick look at why he is so bullish. So when I say bullish, I actually mean that he wants to lower the interest rates. He first mentioned the recession risk. He said that if there are major tariff issues and a significant downturn in the economy, he would currently favor lowering the interest rates, and he would prefer to do it sooner rather than later. That means this is very, very bullish, or the technical term when talking about central banks is dovish. So when you lower the interest rates, it's referred to as being dovish. We also see here that Fed Governor Waller views tariffs as inflationary, but considers the inflation to be transitory, which would also argue for interest rate cuts in the long term. We see here, in his view, the risk of recession is more important to consider than the risk of inflation. This also tends to argue for interest rate cuts, because if you have inflation under control but want to prevent a recession, then you have to print. And then there was also a very, very interesting report about an X where someone writes here an important pivot from Waller. Pivot simply means making a reversal, because currently it doesn't yet look like all central banks want to immediately lower interest rates. But he is definitely in the camp that most advocates for lowering interest rates here. And that also means here, keep in mind that Waller was appointed by Trump in 2020, and his recent positioning could indeed be a strategic move to present himself as a top candidate for Powell's succession. So he apparently already has sympathies from Donald Trump, and he is now positioning himself with interest rate cuts, and that it aligns with Donald Trump's politics, that Donald Trump could potentially appoint him here. I mean, Donald Trump can't appoint him, but Donald Trump might have tried to find out if Jerome Powell can be kicked out. And if that's possible, then he can definitely appoint Jerome Powell's successor here. The process is still ongoing, whether this is really possible. Within the FOMC, the member most willing to swing the pendulum towards a rate cut could have the best chances to become the next chairman. So not only from Donald Trump, if that should work out, but also within Apple and Seberding, there's currently a very, very high chance attributed if Jerome Powell should be ousted. And we have now looked at how money might soon be printed again in the USA. But money is also being printed with Bitcoin, and we need to quickly take a look at that as well. A TV report has now been published by TerraHash, the first Bitcoin mining startup, in Germany, and they have taken a look into the mining lab. Let's take a quick look at that as well. because it's highly significant what's being reported here about Bitcoin and Bitcoin mining in Germany.
The innovation of the Koffer Group is also evident in the company's basement with Bitcoin mining. In 2022, the startup Terahash Energy was founded here for this purpose.
We are developing solutions to effectively, locally, and economically utilize the surplus energy from all the power generation plants we have in Germany. There are various areas of application. One of them is municipal district heating. We can convert the electricity generated by the power plants directly on site into heat, and ultimately we have a mechanism where electricity goes in as an input and two outputs come out. One is a digital value, namely Bitcoin, and the second output is heat. We can utilize the heat here in high quality at up to 85 degrees, and thus we are qualified to supply local or district heating networks.
And the development continues, and the use of the technology is also conceivable in the private sector in the future.
There are technical possibilities to conduct mining at home, including with the PV system. However, we are still at the very beginning of these developments.
Innovative and versatile is the Klager Group, and the success is also based on the satisfaction of the employees.
Well, I found this very, very impressive. Feel free to write in the comments below what you think about all these things, like the US printing money again, Bitcoin mining here, and now many other things in Germany. If you still want to buy Bitcoin, you can find the link below to 21 Bitcoin, where you can easily and securely buy Bitcoin. With the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can still get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin. See you guys, peace out.